In 1815, the Duke of Wellington faced Napoleon Bonaparte at Waterloo. Most historians focus on the grand tactics, the heroic cavalry charges, the steadfast infantry squares. But the real battle wasn't fought on the field. It was fought here. It was a war between calculating patience and corrosive ego, and victory would go to the commander who could master not only his own army, but the mind of his enemy. To understand Waterloo, we must first dissect the two minds that converged there. They were not merely rival generals. They were opposing psychological archetypes. On one side, Napoleon Bonaparte, the artist of war. Escaped from Elba, he was no longer just an emperor, but a living legend attempting to will an empire back into existence. His entire strategic philosophy was a projection of his persona: speed, audacity, and the relentless pursuit of the single shattering blow, the bataille decisive. For him, war was an act of creative genius, a canvas upon which he painted with cannon fire and massed columns. His mind operated on intuition, on the belief that his presence on the battlefield was itself a gravitational force, bending events to his will. But here, in 1815, we see how this strength had metastasized into a fatal weakness. His spectacular return from exile had reinforced his most dangerous cognitive bias, a narcissistic belief in his own destiny. In his private assessments, he dismissed Wellington as a sepoy general, a cautious commander of no real genius. He brushed off the Prussian army as already broken after the Battle of Ligny. This wasn't a strategic assessment. It was an act of ego preservation. He was constructing a reality that suited his narrative, a classic symptom of a commander whose past successes have convinced him of his own infallibility. He was no longer analyzing the enemy. He was projecting his own contempt onto them. On the other side stood Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, the architect of victory. Where Napoleon was fire, Wellington was iron. His mind had not been forged in the crucible of revolutionary fervor, but in the long, grinding campaigns of the Peninsular War. There, he had learned that battles were won not by singular flashes of genius, but by logistics, meticulous positioning, and the patient exploitation of an opponent's predictable aggression. He was a master of the defensive, choosing his ground not for its glorious vistas, but for its tactical advantages: the reverse slope, the hidden ditch, the fortified farmhouse. Here, we see a mind fundamentally grounded in realism. Wellington's famous description of his own men as the scum of the earth is often misunderstood as aristocratic disdain. It was, in fact, the height of psychological clarity, an unsentimental appraisal of his tools. He knew his army was a fragile coalition, not the fanatical instrument Napoleon wielded. Therefore, he built systems to protect it, to mitigate its weaknesses, to use it with maximum efficiency. He didn't believe in destiny. He believed in preparation. His mind was a fortress, carefully constructed, with every contingency planned for. He did not seek to impose his will on the chaos of battle. He sought to manage it. The confrontation to come would be more than a clash of armies. It would be a collision of these two profoundly different inner worlds. That collision began not with a cannonade, but with a pregnant, rain-soaked silence on the morning of June 18th. Napoleon delayed his attack, waiting for the muddy ground to harden. Militarily, it was a defensible choice. Psychologically, it was a profound error born of supreme self-regard. The emperor, who had once marched his armies across Europe at lightning speed, now believed the timetable of this decisive battle was his to command. He acted as if his Prussian adversary, Blücher, would politely wait off stage until his cue. It was an assumption rooted not in intelligence, but in an ego that could no longer conceive of an opponent operating on an independent schedule. In those quiet, damp hours, Napoleon's most formidable enemy was not Wellington, but his own corrosive confidence. When the assault finally came, it was aimed at a landscape that was a perfect extension of Wellington's own mind. The ridge at Mont Saint-Jean was not a dramatic escarpment. It was a gentle, rolling reverse slope. Here we see Wellington's genius for psychological warfare expressed through terrain. By placing the bulk of his forces behind the crest, he rendered them all but invisible to French artillerymen. He denied Napoleon the one thing his artistic method of war craved: a clear target. The battlefield became a frustrating void, a canvas that refused to show itself. It forced the French to advance into an unknown, provoking uncertainty and neutralizing their single greatest advantage, their grand batteries. While Napoleon needed to see the whole battle to conduct it like an orchestra, Wellington was content to manage his, piece by piece, from within the chaos. The first test of these opposing philosophies came at the fortified farmhouse of Hougoumont. Intended as a diversionary attack to draw Wellington's reserves, it instead became a microcosm of the entire battle. Napoleon's commanders, and perhaps Napoleon himself, became fixated on this single strong point. The feint devolved into a bloody, obsessive siege, consuming thousands of elite French troops for a strategically insignificant prize. It was a classic example of target fixation, a tactical error driven by the psychological inability to accept being defied. Wellington, meanwhile, fed just enough men into the farm's defense to hold it, refusing to overcommit. He diagnosed the French obsession and allowed them to bleed their strength against its walls. He was not fighting the point on the map. He was fighting the weakness in his enemy's mind. The true crucible, however, came in the afternoon. Marshal Ney, the bravest of the brave, mistook the movement of Allied wounded for a general retreat. Sensing the decisive moment, he launched one of history's greatest cavalry charges, a torrent of thousands of armored horsemen against Wellington's infantry. Yet the infantry was not broken. They formed their iconic squares, bristling bastions of bayonets that the French cavalry could surge around, but never breach. And Napoleon, watching this unfold, allowed it to happen. He knew it was a blunder, reportedly muttering it was an hour too soon, yet he committed more and more cavalry to reinforce Ney's folly. Why? Here, we are no longer looking at a grand strategist in full command of his faculties. We are seeing a commander whose cognitive model is failing. The battle refused to follow his script. His opponent was refusing to break. In allowing Ney's charge to continue, Napoleon was perhaps succumbing to a gambler's fallacy, throwing good money after bad, hoping one more push would miraculously deliver the victory his ego demanded. He had lost control of his subordinates, and more importantly, of the battle's psychological rhythm. All the while, Wellington rode his lines, a calm, grim-faced manager reinforcing his system. His famous utterance, "Hard pounding this, gentlemen, let's see who will pound longest," was not a boast. It was the mission statement of his entire strategy. He had built a psychological dam, and his only task now was to hold it against the Napoleonic storm, trusting that his meticulous preparations and the approaching Prussians would see it through. He wasn't trying to win in a flash of brilliance. He was simply planning to outlast his opponent's rage. The final act of this psychological drama came as the shadows lengthened across the bloody fields. With the Prussians finally engaging his flank, Napoleon played his last card. He committed the Imperial Guard. This was more than a tactical decision. It was a final, desperate appeal to his own myth. The Guard was the physical embodiment of his invincibility, a force that had never been broken in a frontal assault. Their advance was the ultimate projection of his will, a belief that legend itself could sweep the field. But Wellington, the architect, had anticipated this. He had kept his own foot guards lying down, hidden behind the ridge. As the French legends crested the slope, Wellington's voice cut through the chaos. "Now, Maitland! Now's your time!" The devastating, point-blank volley that followed did more than tear through the guards' ranks. It shattered an aura. The cry, "La garde recule," the guard retreats, was the death knell not just of a military unit, but of the psychological foundation of Napoleon's entire army. Here, in the final analysis, we see the undeniable truth of the battle. Wellington did not win by being a better Napoleon. He won by being the ultimate anti-Napoleon. His victory was not one of superior genius, but of superior character. Napoleon, the artist, was undone by his own masterpiece, the legend of his infallibility. His audacity decayed into recklessness, his confidence into a blinding hubris that made him underestimate his foe and mismanage his subordinates. He sought one perfect, decisive stroke, and in his impatient pursuit of it, he exhausted his army's strength against a system designed to absorb just that. Wellington's triumph was the triumph of resilience over brilliance. It was a victory of cold, hard realism over romantic self-delusion. He understood the brutal calculus of war, that it is not enough to have a plan. You must have the psychological fortitude to see it through the friction, chaos, and terror of the crucible. He mastered not only the mind of his enemy, predicting his aggression and channeling it to his doom, but also his own, maintaining a chilling composure under pressure that few commanders in history have ever matched. Waterloo was not merely the end of an emperor. It was a timeless lesson that the most critical terrain in any conflict is the landscape of the human mind. Napoleon's strategy in 1815 was a high-risk gamble for a decisive victory, the only kind that could secure his throne. Wellington's was a methodical plan of attrition that accepted the risk of being slowly ground down. As supreme commander, which psychological burden would be harder to bear? The acute pressure of Napoleon's all-or-nothing attack, or the chronic strain of Wellington's defensive waiting game? Share your strategic assessment in the comments below.